Hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thanks so much, Tara, for inviting me to be part of the symposium. I've really enjoyed the talk so far. For my talk, I'd like to share a sort of a more of a broad conceptual perspective on this issue of technology-enabled mental health assessment and how it can play a role in improving care. So my background is in cognitive and affective neuroscience and human electrophysiology, and I currently work at X, which is Alphabet's innovation lab, and it was formerly known as Google X. So this is the same place that's worked on projects like self-driving cars, internet access from balloons, computational agriculture, and tools for ocean preservation. So we work on moonshots. So these are projects where technology can make a meaningful contribution to solving some of the world's hardest problems. And I came to X to work on a project called Amber, an early stage project that brought together expertise from psychology, neuroscience, and machine learning to work on technology-enabled mental health assessment using EEG. And we've recently wrapped up our work. And this talk today is the first time that we're sharing the details of it publicly. So let's talk about the problem before we get to some possible solutions. Today, although we have evidence that measurement-based care is more effective, it's still not being widely implemented for a whole range of reasons. Things like burden, stigma, trust, fragmentation of approach. Now, to the extent that measurement-based care is being practiced, it's traditionally based on administering instruments like the BDI or the PHQ-9 that you see here. And this is done to derive a sum score for a given individual. Now, there are a few things that make this approach problematic. First of all, as you see here, these tools require people to report their symptoms retrospectively over the past several weeks. And there are serious questions about how accurately can people do this. We know that human beings aren't very good at computing averages over time, and we know that memory is easily biased. Second, and related to this point, a sum score metric is really fairly low information yield, since mental health disorders are very dynamic and they fluctuate over time. So our sleep, mood, anxiety levels, they change substantially within days, but even within hours. So if we're not capturing those fluctuations, then we're missing some pretty vital data. A clinician who's seeing their client on multiple occasions in time is going to have a pretty low resolution clinical impression of that client, as long as their functioning is being summarized by a single quantitative metric that aggregates over many different types of symptoms. And in the end, this provides very little insight into the consistent set of problem areas that are cropping up for a given individual, and actually risks missing out on particular areas where someone might be demonstrating signs of improvement. And finally, as the work of researchers like Heiko Fried and many of the talks that we heard this morning has demonstrated, there's a huge number of permutations of different symptoms that can all effectively meet diagnostic criteria for a given disorder. Just to give an example, if you know that Jane and Steve have identical PHQ-9 scores, that tells us next to nothing about how their depression or anxiety are manifesting in their particular case. And in fact, it's entirely possible that they may not even share one single symptom in common. Now, to make all this even worse, the commonly used clinical scales tend to have less content overlap than you would want to see. So an instrument may not even inquire or ask about the very symptoms or symptom areas that are actually most salient to a particular individual. And the end result of all of this is that the question of who needs what, when, and why often just stays unanswered. So whether that's asked from the perspective of a clinician who's trying to decide whether a person needs medication, or from the perspective of a public health official or a university administrator. So we believe that existing methods for measuring mental health, although they're obviously better than nothing, they fall short of what we need to do to drive better outcomes for individuals with mental health issues, for clinicians, and for payers. So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to lay out a proposal for a multimodal framework that I think may help to pave the way for this vision. And it combines the EEG work that we did at X with some other emerging technology-enabled measurement tools, things like ecological momentary assessments or EMAs and digital phenotyping. And this multimodal approach is sort of centered around integrating subjective and objective data, as well as having both episodic and continuous data collection schedules. So here are the proposed input streams. And the point here is that each of these streams makes a unique and complementary contribution that is used to basically draw a full picture of the mental health of a given individual, a sort of a precision phenotype. And we think that technology can help collect and integrate data from a variety of these sources, including self-report data, but also behavioral data from wearables and smartphones, and brain physiological measures, things like EEG and fMRI measures. So the first input here is ecological momentary assessments, or EMAs. So these capture the subjective experiences of the individual, and the questions are usually drawn from basically validated surveys and clinical interviews, things like the BDI, the PHQ-9, the quiz, so forth. But the crucial difference is that instead of being asked to answer these questions retrospectively, they would be delivered, or they're delivered daily at the relevant moment using a smartphone app. And we actually found when we applied unsupervised machine learning techniques to some standard surveys, to single items from these surveys, we found that the symptoms usually cluster around identifiable themes. So for example, problems with attention, memory, concentration, they tend to hang together, and they tend to be different or distinct from symptoms related to body aches and pains and so forth. The second input here is digital phenotyping. So this would be using passive data from smartphones or consumer wearables, things like the Fitbit, an Oura Ring, Apple Watch. This is used to derive features that are relevant to mental health, things like sleep duration, quality, activity levels, heart rate variability, all of those kinds of things. Now, there's a lot that's been written on the promise of digital phenotyping lately. There's several teams around the world who are trying to make this work, a really difficult problem, obviously. And our colleagues at Verily are running a smartphone-based mood study as part of their baseline project that some of you may have heard of. They've also partnered with the Aurora study. They've been collecting sleep, activity, and heart rate data with their Study Watch wearable. And Dr. Menachem Fromer, who's the mental health data science lead at Verily, recently presented some of these results at the Harvard Computational Neurosciences Symposium, basically finding that early findings suggesting that certain features, things like sleep onset and offset in particular, may be emerging as pretty strong predictors of depression in this case. So when it comes to these more objective data streams, we believe that their fusion with subjective data from EMA is complementary. It's not like one is necessarily replacing the other. So for example, you can have really insightful dissociations between subjective estimates of one's sleep duration and more objective measures that you would derive from a wearable data. So this brings me to the third input source, which is neural activity, specifically brain physiological activity. And today I'll be talking about it in the form of resting state EEG as well as ERPs. So there's a pretty sizable literature at this point that's demonstrating how EEG-based neural measures can inform clinical research. If you take all of that data together, there's pretty solid evidence that EEG and ERPs can be related to continuous variability in psychopathology, but also to categorical diagnoses. They can be related to genetic risk. They can index an important moderating factor in responses to stress. They can be used as predictors of clinical trajectories. They can be used to predict responses to treatment, as we just heard from Dr. Atkin. They can be used to identify individuals who have greater odds of developing mental health disorders in the future. The issue, though, is that most of these studies, at least traditionally, have been done in specialist academic neuroscience labs. And in order to move this forward a little bit and to make EEG clinically relevant and actually deployable in primary care, a counseling center, a psychiatry clinic, we have to make the EEG more accessible and usable at scale. And this is basically what our team at X has been working on. So again, traditionally, these EEG hardware systems have been pretty expensive, and they usually require pretty substantial expertise for acquiring the signal, doing the post-processing and cleaning, and then doing the interpretation of the signal. So what we did is that our team of hardware and software engineers and neuroscientists at X designed an easy-to-use, low-cost, portable EEG system. And our headset that you see here can actually be put on and set up in just a few minutes with minimal training. And partly this is because the headset uses just 3 dry sensors that are arranged along the cortical midline. And they capture the channels that are most relevant for many of these standard experimental assessments that you would do in a sort of a traditional ERP approach. Our BioAmp actually supports up to 32 channels, so you could connect a standard headset with some fairly minor modifications to this. When we tested the signal-to-noise ratio of our system, it was comparable to our research-grade devices that we tested in a feasibility study. And the build cost was actually under $1,000, and that was including the BioAmp, the headset, and the sensors. So the system that we built allows researchers to get both resting state EEG as well as event-related brain potential signals. And for collecting ERPs, there is a separate stimulus presentation program that's used to co-register event triggers with the EEG data as well as alongside behavioral outputs. So in the work that we did, we focused on the inclusion of sort of specifically designed psychological tests that would give us levers into particular computational cognitive systems. So these are kind of like psychological probes that are analogous to a cardiac stress test, let's say. In other words, we pressure test a specific computational system, and we basically assess its function in individuals. And what we envision is that these assessments of neural activity would be conducted sporadically, so maybe every few months during an in-clinic visit. And the role of this would be to provide a more objective index that's less susceptible to memory bias or distortion, and that's giving you a read of these basic cognitive and emotional systems. Now, a specific example of an assessment like this is the DOORS task. This was a task that was designed by Greg Hychik's laboratory at the Florida State University. So this is a task that requires people to pick one of 2 different doors. Either door, one of the doors is associated with either a win or a loss. That's either in monetary incentives or in points. So as a task, it's pretty sensitive to reward-related deficits that we know exist in individuals with depression, for example. So individuals with depression will exhibit these blunted frontal midline responses to wins versus losses when you compare them to healthy controls. And this blunted neural response, which is indicated in this by the shaded area here, it's a pretty classic ERP effect, and we were able to replicate it on our dry sensor EEG hardware system, which is the plot that I'm showing you here. So another task involves just having individuals either with or without a diagnosis of major depression view pleasant and neutral emotional images drawn from the IAPS database. And typically what you would find is that positive images would elicit a sort of heightened cortical positivity, what's known as the late positive potential. Usually that appears about 300 milliseconds after the image onsets, and it's a pretty sustained waveform. And again, here we were able to demonstrate that our hardware could capture the reduction in this LPP component, this cortical response to pleasant images, when you look at it in a group of individuals diagnosed with depression and you contrast it with healthy controls. So these types of neural responses, we think, offer new information that goes beyond what can be captured by an EMA question or a passive wearable metric. So for example, since brain function might be expected to be a bit more stable than episodic fluctuations in EMA responses, we think that these measures can tell us something relevant about neural circuitry and cognitive systems, and they can be used to derive forecasts of future risk, or they can be used to predict treatment responses, as we just heard in the previous talk. So today, we're excited to be open sourcing our hardware designs, our visualizer, and the stimulus software of the AMBER prototype EEG system. And we're putting the code on GitHub. We're also pledging the free use of our patents and applications that are listed in our patent pledge. And we're gonna make these resources available so that the mental health researchers have all of the specifications, all of the code, all of the permissions that they would need to basically rebuild our EEG system, or they can design their own based on these specs. And in addition, we're excited to announce that we're donating 50 assembled AMBER prototype devices to Sapien Labs. And this will be for use by researchers worldwide as part of their Human Brain Diversity Project. This is a project that supports EEG research globally, and it has an emphasis on low-income countries and underrepresented groups. I really believe that establishing these large global data sets that include both EEG assessments and clinical data is going to be absolutely crucial for pushing this whole area forward. And I'm really excited by this particular initiative because it's including exactly the kind of rich cognitive and mental health assessments that I think are required for moving towards having these higher granularity assessments, higher granularity phenotyping than what's been possible by using traditional sum score summaries in research. Now the other major challenge when if you want to make EEG measures clinically useful comes from basically the difficulty in having automated ways for denoising the signals at scale, and also knowing which aspects of the signal are relevant. So basically the situation today is that interpreting EEG requires a fair amount of expertise in signal processing, machine learning, all of these things. So our team at X, along with collaborators at DeepMind, has worked to adapt methods from deep representation learning to address these challenges. And there were two significant outcomes of our efforts. First, we demonstrated that representation learning approaches, such as autoencoders, could be leveraged to effectively denoise EEG trials without having a human expert in the loop at all. And this is important for being able to process research EEG data sets at scale. Second of all, we offer a proof of concept validation that it's possible to extract interpretable, clinically meaningful features from ERPs. So we were able to use these disentangled ERP representations that we got from autoencoders to predict multiple clinical labels that were obtained from a clinician-administered interview, the SCID. So basically means that we feel fairly confident that embedded within these ERP representations, there is clinically meaningful, clinically relevant signal that can be mined by researchers. And it should also be mentioned that we were able to do this for on an individual participant level, so rather than on the basis of statistically average groups. And obviously that's an important requirement for future deployment in clinics. And I think what's also really exciting about this work is that the methods were actually found to be capable of recovering usable signal representations from single EEG trials. And this is a really good sign for applicability because in principle, it suggests that it may be possible to get clinically useful information from brain electrophysiology, even if you have far fewer data samples than what has traditionally been used in research labs, where usually you would rely on hundreds of repetitions of experimental trials. So obviously I can't get into the details in this short talk, but you can read much more about it on our archive preprint that I'm linking to here. So just to close this out, we can reconsider how these various input streams and data modalities might actually be useful for having comprehensive mental health assessments of the future. So again, I think that each input source is providing unique sources of information. And the best way to think of this is that they're complementing one another rather than one modality like EEG completely replacing another, like self-report data, for example. So in the plot that I have here on the far left, the various inputs are arranged on this vertical axis. And this axis basically highlights the point that each modality has its own contribution and its own time sensitivity. So things like EMA are really sensitive for grabbing these momentary fluctuations in symptoms like negative affect, sadness, motivation levels, things like that. And so these are things that might change on an hour-by-hour basis. And they're the closest that we can get to the actual lived experience of an individual. Digital phenotyping and passive sensing measures are probably one step above that. And for example, you could have day by day, or you can have weekly summaries of things like sleep and activity levels. And this could shed light on a completely distinct set of systems that are operating within the organism. And finally, I think that measures of neural activity, as indexed by things like resting EEG and ERPs, but also fMRI and other measures, what they're doing is they're providing relatively deep insights into more like dispositional vulnerability factors and the underlying pathophysiological mechanisms that underlie a disorder like depression or anxiety. And this is just a hypothesis, but I think it's possible that these factors are changing much more slowly, probably on the order of weeks to months rather than hours like EMA. And sort of the pitch that I would put in for measures of neural activity like EEG, and what I think makes them exciting is that they're telling us something that's really important about future risk or future trajectories of disorder. And this is the kind of information that is just missing. You're not going to get it if you're strictly focusing on momentary fluctuations that you might be getting from self-report measures like EMAs. So as a way of concluding, I believe that technology can enable person-centric, measurement-based mental health care at scale. And I think technology can help us answer the age-old question of, who needs what, when, and why. And it can also deliver the relevant interventions digitally whenever and wherever they're needed. I think better measurements will empower individuals with lived experience and their healthcare providers to better match intervention options to the person's needs. Also to measure the impact of those interventions and ultimately to promote better mental health for everyone. I don't think we're there yet. I think although the promise of emerging measurement techniques, things like EEGs and ERPs and digital phenotyping is really exciting, it's still pretty early days for technology-enabled mental health measurement. Our hope is that by open sourcing our EEG system, publishing our ML techniques, that this will be of value not just to the EEG researchers, but also to the whole global mental health research community. People who were maybe put off by the complexity and the cost of working with EEG systems before. I really think that addressing the challenges that we face today is going to call for new partnerships between scientists, clinicians, technologists, policymakers, and maybe most importantly, actually individuals with lived experience. And I think now, probably more than ever, we need more of these diverse voices. We need more multidisciplinary collaboration and more open sharing of knowledge, and with the goal of unlocking better mental health for everyone. And with that, I'd just like to thank the amazing collaborators, the amazing team at X, our academic advisors who are all listed on here, and it's been a blast working with all of them.